If you have the displeasure of living in County Durham, you might have seen on your travels a weird and wonderful place called Shildon, with on the sign stating the Cradle of the Railways on it. So, what claim does this town of 10,000 have, being the birthplace of the railways? So, what I got told in school was this little bloke called Timothy Hackworth, who was pals with George Stephenson. So Stephenson and Hackworth got in this little room, and while Stephenson designed it, Hackworth, with a strong Shildonese spirit, probably nicked some steel from Middlesbrough and built the locomotion. And that no one knows him, because there is an agenda against Shildon by the Bishop of Leeds. Okay. Maybe 70% of that was hyperbole, but you get the point. Very simplified version of events, why Shildon was seen as the home of the railway. But is this claim accurate? Or marketing so people go to the new locomotion museum and then leave as quickly as possible? Personally, I think this claim is somewhat accurate, but especially how people get taught it is quite wrong. First of all, defining the first train is very difficult, as it is difficult to say even where it comes from within the UK. The official claimant is Richard Tevwick. He created the prototype steam locomotive, the Pendarren Steelworks in Wales. So this railway was originally invested in by Sam Ewell Humphrey in 1803, who was the owner of the steelworks. He wanted these trains to transport steel 9 miles towards the Canal Wharf at Abercune. However, the first steam locomotion failed after travelling 5 miles, due to the locomotion being too heavy for the tracks, and it then broke, with the engine itself still being used to operate the forge at the steelworks. One of the other claimants is again from Tevwick, again, but in Coalbrookdale in 1802. However, I cannot find much on this at all. And even Wikipedia says, I don't really know. So the claim is dubious at best, and the Pendarren Steelworks Railway is most unlikely the first operational steelwork with steam engines, even if, yes, the steam engines didn't really work. So the most accurate claim to at least the birthplace of the railway is Pendarren in Wales from 1803 to 1804. However, it could also be Coalbrookdale in 1802, but these were both made by Richard Tevwick in Wales and the West Midlands respectively. So yet again, first operational railway was in 1812. It was in Yorkshire and Leeds, with the Middleton Railway being the first commercial railway to be opened. The first operational locomotion being the Salamanca, designed by John Blenkscoff. Even then, we only finally get our link back to Shildon in 1813 with the creation of the Puffing Billy. This was produced by George Stephenson, William Headley, Jonathan Forster, and finally Timothy Hackworth. The same Timothy Hackworth from 2 minutes ago. So George Stephenson and his squad expanded the railways at collieries. The first class of locomotion, the Killingworth locomotives, were created. These were from 1814 to 1816, with the Blucher being the first of its class. And yes, this is the same Blucher who said he had delusions of a Frenchman impregnating him with an elephant. That Blucher. Within this class, there was also the Wellington and the Killingworth Billy after 1815. However, Shildon itself wasn't directly involved in the railway until 1818, when Parliament officially stated a plan for the Stockton to Darlington Railroad, its road going through Shildon and its collieries. With the first show of the Darlington to Stockton Railway on September 27th, 1825, Shildon was the official start of locomotion number 1 starting journey from Shildon to Stockton, with Shildon being the start of the first public locomotive-powered railway journey, with around 450 to 600 passengers being on board, with the train reaching top speeds of 25 kilometers per hour, and went from Darlington to Stockton in 3 hours and 7 minutes, which is faster than today, because you can't even get a direct train from Darlington to Stockton anymore. Yeah. However, for locomotion number 1, it was built in Newcastle, so not much of the actual locomotive itself was related to Shildon, besides from one of its engineers/designers. However, the following locomotives, Timothy Hackworth is a new locomotive superintendent of the Darlington to Stockton line. He made new trains and reconfigured old trains. So he made the train like the Royal George in 1827. This was at the works in Shildon, the Soho Works. So much of the following locomotives on the line were reconfigured and improved upon in Shildon, as long as various locomotives also being built. Like Nova Scotia's first train was built in Shildon as well. Little fun fact. And Shildon was, in a way, sort of like the improvement centre of these trains, although a lot of them are manufactured in Newcastle or eventually Darlington. Shildon was where a lot of the configurations happened. So, for example, six-wheel locomotives were introduced by Timothy Hackworth, and it just became one of those places where trains were repaired. Despite this, I would argue places like Penydarren were the real cradle of the railways. So really, the claim cradle of the railways should be cradle of the first public railway that is locomotive powered. Although it doesn't slip off the tongue the same way, of course. As for Timothy Ackworth, like as I mentioned, his influence on the railways was still large. His trains like the Royal George were still revolutionary. However, how this subject is taught, especially to me, Timothy Ackworth's importance, especially in the development of the locomotions, like locomotion number 1, the older Killingworth's locomotives, is overstated, while people like Headley and Foster's impact on the development are very understated. Does this very ambiguous claim that Shildon was the cradle of the railways really matter? The railways basically created Shildon, with the population rise from 11821 to 12,000 by the end of the century. With a very heavy reliance on the railway industry within the town, with the large wagonworks site that was there until its closure in 1983. From then, the town had declined from a peak population of 14,000 to modern day having around 10,000. And I mean, the only major things left in Shildon are the roads and rail link to leave. Okay, jokes aside, there's a really nice locomotion museum that is there, and since its opening in 2004, it's had 3 million visitors and regularly has trains like the Flying Scotsman there. At one point had Locomotion 1 there, or at least a replica, and has had various trains, and just a really cool place to go. I am going to make a video looking more in depth at the Darlington Stockton Railway itself, as 200 years is coming up in around a month. So, stay tuned for that. And this is mostly unedited because I have another 8 or 9 videos I want to get out before I start uni. So, thank you for watching, and adios.